Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure for me to get this opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about what science and technology can do to create a better and more sustainable world in the decades that lie ahead. In other words, how science can contribute to the ecological civilization. My plan is as follows. I will first tell you what I see as the most likely world development towards the middle of the century. I will then tell you what should be done in order to improve the situation. In other words, what we, humanity, can do to improve our well-being in the future. And finally, I will tell you what science and technology can do to make it simpler to get the desirable measures agreed and implemented. And as you will see, there are numerous important and unsolved tasks, both in the natural sciences and in the social sciences. It is also a great pleasure for me to talk to you from the Kingdom of Norway. Our small nation developed itself from a relatively poor to a moderately rich country during the 3 decades from 1935 to 1965. I mention this because the technique Norway used in increasing the well-being of its citizens is similar to the one that global society will have to use in the decades ahead if we are going to create a better world for most people. In Norway, an active state pursued a science-based strategy which was aimed to improve the situation for all Norwegians. The state did not only focus on economic growth and maximum GDP, the state also engaged in active redistribution. And finally, the state also put in place unprofitable solutions like roads and ferry boats to remote locations, free education for all, from kindergarten to university, and free health for all. The state did all of this since the goal was to improve the well-being of all of the people, not only of the urban elites. In other words, the state did what the free market could never do and paid for it through progressive taxation. I mention this story because I believe it will require collective action, an active state to solve the problems facing global society in this century. It will not be enough with voluntary individual efforts. The market won't be able to solve the problem on its own. So what is likely to happen in the world towards 2050? I've spent most of my life in futures research trying to answer that question. A book from 2012, 2052, a global forecast for the next 40 years, gives the answer. It has sold surprisingly well in China. When I look into the future, I see global society racing towards a cliff. We're moving full speed towards irreversible climate change, large-scale biodiversity loss, and destruction of natural beauty. The problems are caused by ever larger populations and ever higher resource use and pollution output per person. The problems are caused by more people and a bigger ecological footprint per person. And to make things worse, we allow inequities to rise, making it more likely that we will see more social tension and more conflict in the future. It is, of course, fully possible to stop all of this, or at least to slow the race towards the cliff. Most problems would be solved if we stopped using fossil fuels and reduced the population through free education, free maternal health, and contraception for all women. The tragedy is that we seem unable to agree on this and others, mainly because action costs more in the short run than doing nothing. This slide is a picture of what I see as the most likely future. Human activity in the form of population and output continues to rise. This leads to a rise in the ecological footprint, that is in resource use and pollution output. The rising footprint leads to rising environmental damage, global warming, destruction of nature. And the environmental damage finally overwhelms the benefits from more income. The result is reduced well-being, for example, via unstable weather, ever more scary forest fires, hurricanes, floods, and droughts, high costs of reconstruction, and less access to natural beauty, in spite of rising income. So what to do? In order to give a science-based answer, we need to agree on what we want to achieve. We need a goal. The UN has agreed on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. What is the likelihood that we will reach these goals? My friends and I gave the answer in our report from 2018 called Transformation is Feasible. Transformation is Feasible was and is a model-based study of different pathways into the future. We looked at a world split in 7 regions and operating on finite planet Earth, that is, within the famous 9 planetary boundaries. Our ambition was to answer the question, how many of the 17 SDGs will humanity achieve by 2030? The answer was depressing. In our base case, in what we see as the most likely future, many SDGs will not be achieved by 2030 and not even by 2050. In other scenarios, we studied possible policies to achieve more SDGs, like faster economic growth, bigger development budgets, and better organization of the effort to reach its SDGs. All had the same negative result. So the sad fact is that neither of these conventional responses achieves the goal. We had to conclude that conventional policy will not achieve all 17 SDGs within 9 planetary boundaries by 2050. Luckily, Transformation is Feasible also included some good news. The good news is that there does indeed exist a set of 5 actions, 5 measures that are capable of achieving all the SDGs on our finite planet within this century. The bad news is that the 5 measures are truly extraordinary. They are unconventional and difficult to sell, both in the rich and the poor world. The 5 measures are shown in my next slide. What needs to be done? 5 measures to save the world. Phase out all of fossil fuels in order to stop climate change. Make agriculture and forestry sustainable to stop biodiversity loss. Reduce the population through free education, health, and contraception to limit the human footprint in the future. 4, make the richest pay the transition cost in order to make the transition politically feasible. 5, use new development models, that is, copy China, Costa Rica, and others in the effort to eradicate poverty. These 5 measures are all technically feasible. We already know what needs to be done and how to do it, but they are not very popular, to say the least. There are 2 main reasons why it is difficult to get acceptance for the 5 measures in liberal market economies. First, the 5 measures cost more in the short term than continuing business as usual. For example, electric cars cost more than fossil cars. Thus, the state needs to pay subsidies if the state wants rapid electrification. And second, the 5 measures lead to loss of jobs when dirty business is replaced with green business. For example, we lose coal worker jobs when we shift from coal-fired utility to solar solar power farms. Thus, the state needs to pay the coal miners an income until they find a new job in the green sector, if the state wants a rapid shift to renewables. Let me sum up. The green shift will be slowed by two factors. First, by the lack of potential profits for the free market. And second, by the understandable fear of job loss among workers and owners in dirty sectors. This double resistance makes it difficult to get broad support for strong action to save the world. Unless we're willing to use unconventional solutions and a strong state, perhaps under the logo, collective action arranged by an active state in order to increase the well-being of the majority. So what can science do to speed the implementation of the 5 measures? What can science do to accelerate the move towards the ecological civilization? The main answer is, do research on the solutions, not on the problems. We already know very well what are the problems: impending climate change, growing inequity, declining biodiversity, melting glaciers, plastics in the ocean, and so on. What we do not know is how to get the 5 measures implemented. This is where world science and technology really can help, both natural science and social science. All you need to ask is, how can I make it simpler to get measure X agreed and implemented? How can I reduce the cost? How can I reduce the loss of jobs? How can we achieve agreement on unpopular measures? How can we reduce the counterforces? How can we reduce the negative impact of all the people who say that this cannot be done? How can we avoid the race to the bottom, i.e. towards the cheapest and most polluting solution? How do we avoid the competition makes it impossible to employ clean but costly solutions? In my experience, a simple way to find a good research topic is to hear what your friends respond when you propose a green measure. Normally they say, this is impossible because it is too expensive, or because it requires consumers to change their habits, or because it will be killed by foreign imports. Your next step then is to use your friend's objections as your starting point and set yourself the task of finding a practical solution to his objection. For example, I often speak about how important it is to reduce the birth rate in the rich world, since rich children leave a much bigger footprint than poor children. My friends always respond as follows: this is impossible. It is impossible to reduce the birth rate because then there will be too few workers to take care of the rising number of old. That objection immediately suggests interesting research tasks. How much do you have to increase the pension age to eliminate the problem? And have you remembered that the total dependency ratio will fall when there are less children? And as robotization reduces the number of jobs, could we concentrate the income-making jobs on those who need it most? Here are numerous tasks, both in the social and natural sciences. Many of them are cross-disciplinary and need a systems perspective, and a research institute with many professions. Since time permits, let me give you a few other examples. In energy, study how much it will actually cost to shift the global economy from fossil fuels to renewable electricity and green hydrogen. The answer is 1% of the world GDP. In other words, it suffices to shift 1% of the world's manpower and 1% of the world's capital from dirty to clean energy production. In land use, study how much more food can be grown in the world if fertilizer use is reduced in the rich world and shifted to the poor world. Study how much water can be saved by shifting production to the most suitable places, and identify the changes in trade agreements needed to do so. In income redistribution, Study how much you must increase the income tax of the world's richest 10% in order to pay the full cost of the transition to a sustainable world. The answer is that you need to increase their income tax by 1 percentage point. Study how one could achieve a democratic majority for this move, but regulations will change. In new development models, study how China managed to 16-double the GDP of its 1.3 billion people in 40 years, something that has never been achieved through application of the Washington Consensus. The list can be made very long, even if you limit yourself to finding practical solutions to short-term obstacles against the 5 measures. This is the same program of work that is needed in order to bring about your ecological civilization. Good luck. There is much work to do.